Disclaimer, there will not be any console war nonsense mentioned in this video. I am aware that I will be talking about an Xbox exclusive game, and I will mention other companies in this critique, but that doesn't mean anything harsh said is specifically towards Microsoft. They have made many mistakes in the past, but I wouldn't say that other companies haven't either. So no, I'm not a fanboy of PlayStation or Nintendo or anything, just because I'm particularly critical of this game for things that may or may not be okay in other games. Anyway, enjoy the video.
So if you've been around the channel for a while, you would understand that my taste in games is obvious. I'm a big fan of single-player action games, and hot take, I especially like when they have a story. I like the idea of playing through what is essentially an interactive film. Video games in the past 20 years have become such an impactful storytelling medium, and it's great to see that we can tell good stories not only in film, television, or books, but through interactive media. With that said, there are definitely games that suck at doing this. One, in my personal opinion, was Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice by Ninja Theory. Now, Ninja Theory has had a hard time finding success, whether that be critically or financially, but I've always respected their commitment to making a good product. Ninja Theory hasn't exactly made a bad game up until this point, as far as I'm aware, but their audience wasn't exactly that big. I never even hated any of their games, even when they're completely controversial like DMC Devil May Cry. I would say that game was a pretty respectable action game, even if its story was bad. However, they had done something different with Hellblade. Hellblade was a narrative-focused game released in 2017 that acted a lot more as a tech demo than an actual video game for the most part. I think the story was really good, but its gameplay was definitely not something I could get into. So as you could imagine, I wasn't really paying attention to the sequel. The sequel was announced to be an Xbox exclusive, as Microsoft bought Ninja Theory for $100 million and expanded the size of their staff, which was initially around 30 people. The game was called Senua's Saga: Hellblade 2. Weird how they changed the formatting, but okay. I saw the trailers and it looked like an impressive technical showcase for the then new Xbox Series consoles, as it'd be an exclusive there. However, I never paid much mind to it, since I didn't really care for the first one all that much, and I had no hope for its sequel to be any better. In any normal circumstances, where the game was properly marketed and got the same praise as the original game, I would have totally skipped this entry and would pay no attention to it. However, that wasn't the case with Hellblade 2 at all. The thing that caught my eye about the game that encouraged me to want to play it to make this video was the game's divisive reception when it finally came out. Obviously, the big games journalists ate this shit up, despite GameSpot not thinking too fondly of it, but everyone else was mixed. A lot of people called it a game that plays itself, or a movie game. It was funny because I barely heard of this critique for the first game, so it must have really been that bad. But what shocked me were the people who are usually okay with cinematic games agreeing that this game is slow and dull and handhold. So I renewed my Game Pass subscription and played this game through cloud streaming because fuck the file size, and my laptop isn't powerful enough to run it, nor do I have a Series S or X. I also got it on Game Pass because fuck dropping $50 on this game that I wasn't even expecting to like all that much anyway. But after 6 hours of boring walking, raiding puzzles, and rigid combat, I can safely say that this is the worst game I've played this year. Okay, maybe second. This game betrays everything a video game is supposed to be. Hellblade 2 is the definition of a walking simulator that I keep hearing people go on about. Do I think the game is everything wrong with the game industry at the moment? No. Do I think that this game probably sets a bad precedent for single-player games? Yeah, kinda. The game, just like the first one, is a tech demo and not really a game at all. Ironically, both released 4 years after the launch of their respective consoles they were on, despite being glorified tech demos. You know what? Fine. Since you guys have been good up to this point, I'll start with the positives, which there are very few of. I think the first thing that anyone with eyes and a functioning brain would notice is that this game looks great. The graphical fidelity is perfect and you can clearly tell that's what they put the most time into. The fine detail and the depth of the world, mixed with the appropriate use of color, is absolutely superb. Hellblade 2 is definitely more visually polished than the first game, which should be the case since it's been 7 years since the first one. The facial capture is still fantastic. It has a lot of fine detail that you don't see from a lot of AAA games right now. Part of that is likely because of what they had to cut back on with the gameplay, but we'll get to that later. The audio design is amazingly implemented too. The spatial audio is especially a nice touch on a technical level. This game is definitely worth experiencing with headphones if you're ever gonna play this. My only issue is with Senua's psychosis-induced voices being annoying for 6 hours, but that'll be explained later. The other audio-related stuff is pretty great too. The voice actors do a great job with the pretty mediocre writing they're working with. It sounds like an insult, but honestly, they acted their asses off for this game, of all things. They gave it their all in the dialogue too, conveying emotion, etc. I also think that the soundtrack of this game is incredibly overlooked, especially in the few times that you actually do get into battle. It's perfect. The music honestly carried a lot of the big set piece moments, which were cool, but that was only because they visually looked cool, not because they had engaging mechanics. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. Alright, final pieces of praise, I guess. I like the moments where your run was actually fast. I swear that's not an insult, but it made big moments actually feel somewhat impactful despite the fact that it's shallow. I'm getting ahead of myself again, but I swear I'm really trying hard to find praise for this game. I'm honestly shocked by how few notes I can actually praise, because most game sequels should be easy layups for most game developers. Surprisingly, even the good stuff from the first Hellblade doesn't carry over well, or is changed for the worse. I'm really trying to like this game, even as a cinematic story, but I can't enjoy any of this. Well, I guess we'll have to now move on to the gameplay. Yeah, the funny thing about the gameplay is that I didn't like it that much in the first game either, but Jesus fucking Christ, this is miserable now. The first Hellblade's gameplay wasn't great, but it was at least somewhat competent at times. It allowed for some slight, shallow fun. This game is once again a walking simulator like never seen before for whatever reason. Something I've noticed in a lot of single-player story-focused games is their balance between cutscenes and story and general gameplay. If I were to guess, most story-centric single-player games should at least be 70 to 80% gameplay and 20 to 30% cutscenes, walking, and story. Hellblade 2 is more the opposite, if not worse. If anything, it's 90% story, walking, dumb puzzles, and cutscenes, and 10% gameplay. Even a game like Final Fantasy XVI, which had a lot of cutscenes and story, doesn't halt itself at the mercy of its own narrative or anything. It still has time for big climactic set pieces, while also having its really engaging gameplay. Hellblade 2 was always at the mercy of its narrative, and often feels afraid to break the mold or even try to have gameplay. There are so many things I've noticed that were somehow worse than in the first one. The first thing I'll mention before is the biggest problem, which are traversal and puzzles. The first thing you start to notice is how you traverse. It's really boring. So if you move the left stick all the way, you walk. But if you hold the left bumper, you sprint. Or rather, a light jog in the park, because Senua can't run for shit in this game unless it's one of those big set pieces where you go into a giant mine prison or whatever. Every time I hold LB, my fingers get exhausted, and then I go back into a walking animation, and then I had to keep pressing on to finish the game's story. Your movement is so slow and sleep-inducingly dull. All you do is walk and light jog to every location, and it's boring. At least in something like Metal Gear Solid 5, you move faster than this. I don't expect any traversal mechanics that are special, since Senua can't fly, nor is she fucking Spider-Man, but she should be able to run faster than this. What makes things worse is climbing up and down things, because it's utter hell. There is no way to have an auto-descending option in gameplay, for whatever reason. Even God of War Ragnarok let me do that. You can't even descend a ladder by sliding down like in any other game that has some sort of vertical climbing tools. You just have to do it as slowly as the game wants you to. Then you get to the thing that made traversing really tedious, which is the fact that if a ledge is even an inch taller than Senua, she can't climb it. Surely realism can't be the reason if, realistically, she can jump and grab a ledge while pushing her body weight against the ledge to climb it, because apparently she just can't do that. That aside, it makes navigation so convoluted and boring. If you happen to encounter these ledges, you basically have to turn the other way or find a smaller ledge that happens to lead to the path. What's funny is that it feels like these ledges aren't climbable just to pad out the runtime. If you could actually climb the sensibly scalable ledges, the game would probably take half as long to beat. Oh, but traversal isn't the only thing to talk about. We have puzzles too! Okay, so there are literally 3 main types of puzzles in the whole game. You have puzzles where you have to line up a bunch of environmental objects to open a door, which is only impossible if you were as tired as I was when playing this game. You have the orb moving / bubble puzzles. Yes, I'm serious. And then you have the torch puzzles where you light and have to put fires out to reveal a path. Fun. The one where you line up objects to replicate a symbol are incredibly tedious and boring. It's not even hard, it's just pure melatonin on my screen. Everything about the puzzle screams tedium, but it's weirdly not the worst of the game's puzzles. Not by a long shot. The orb and torch puzzles can honestly go fuck themselves for wasting every bit of my time. The orb puzzles are completed by basically doing this realm shift mechanic, where you'll have to see the environment differently to obtain the orb through some bubble or something. You then have to move the orb to the main altar, And then the third chapter of the game, which is the absolute worst one, you have to do this for about an hour or two. It couldn't possibly get worse, right? No, the torch puzzles are even worse because it's more tedium. Now you have to be the main traversal's bitch because Senua here can't climb a ledge slightly higher than her by jumping. So you have to walk to the torch altar to either light it or put it out, then gratuitously walk all the way around the path without ledges, then you put out or light another fire, and then you do the same shit until the game decides you're done. This entire part of the game is so boring and absolutely torturous to get through. It made me realize I'm not even playing a game anymore. I am watching a movie and doing chores in the middle. Who the hell even finds this fun? I don't even know why the games journalists like this, because it's literally just brain dead and not fun at the same time. I'd rather do the Final Fantasy VII Rebirth Shinra vacuum drivel than move more orbs in this shit. At least that only pops up maybe 2 or 3 times throughout the whole 40-hour campaign. Hell, I would rather play any other brain dead puzzle from any other single player game with low points like this, because at the very least I have fun to look forward to, despite the game entering a bit of a lull for a time. What do you have to look forward to in Hellblade 2? Walking. Just dandy, because I love walking around in a straight line as Senua's voices spoon feed me the game's themes, and somehow are less useful than they were last time. Oh right, I didn't talk about how the voices are annoying in this game now. In the first game, the voices had more of a general purpose. They basically existed to guide Senua through the storytelling, and very few times during gameplay, especially since there wasn't UI in that game. In here, they basically just give you answers even if you're trying to feel smart solving this game's brain-dead puzzles. Not only do they give you answers and cheat the whole way through, but they also just talk way more now generally. All the voices do is yap on about nonsense the whole way through. The game even flat out thinks you're an idiot and makes it so that the voices tell you when Senua goes through a character development moment, or will cheer Senua on and say she's so brave. It's basically just ego stroking for the main character for some reason, but I'll explain that more in the story section, so don't worry. You know where they're more annoying in this game though? Combat. In Senua's Sacrifice, they were basically an auditory UI of sorts in combat. They'd call out if enemies are behind you, and the game didn't muffle the sound too much, nor did it overemphasize the voices. The voices were loud enough to hear, but not so loud that combat was basically a Simon Says challenge. In Hellblade 2, they're completely useless, even as far as storytelling goes. All they do is basically say stuff that the player should be thinking instead of, hearing. Instead of notifying you if an enemy is behind you, or reminding you to block at the very last moment to parry, they instead just talk. They'll say something like, "He's fast, but you must be faster," or "He's clearly evil, so we'll clearly take him down, right?" All the dialogue loses its purpose and it makes encounters feel less intense and engaging, and more irritating if anything. It's incredibly annoying when they don't give useful information like a "behind you" or something. It makes sense why they can't anymore because guess what? All of the battles are now one-on-one instead of featuring multiple enemies. For some reason they thought it would be better for the relatively sparse fighting to have you fight just one enemy at a time instead of 2 or 3 like the other game. In the last game, there could be multiple enemies, and combat supported that, even if at times things could get a little wonky. It made you feel powerful and confident taking on these larger-than-life beings. Granted, the combat wasn't that good, but it was punchier and more impactful. Hellblade 1's combat was more engaging, even if it was very shallow compared to other Ninja Theory games, like that Devil May Cry reboot game. Hellblade 2 dismisses all of that in favor of feeling cinematic and intense. Unfortunately, this translated to being janky and not engaging in the slightest iota. The best way to describe combat is to imagine the melee combat of early Uncharted games, but with a sword and it's more janky and restrictive. I won't pretend that the first game had Devil May Cry levels of combat, but it was far closer to cool but shallow combat than this. Instead of cool but shallow, we just get shallow. If the first game's combat was a 3-foot pool, this game is an evaporating puddle. Not only does it feel slower, but the enemies go at you literally one at a time. Instead of having multiple enemies to dodge or attack, you instead have these fuckers that patiently wait their turn as you pick them off. It's honestly quite sad because it not only makes encounters easier, but it also makes them more monotonous and unengaging. You have a fast light attack, a slow heavy attack, a dodge, a focus meter insta-kill thing, a block, and a parry. That's all you have. There's no potential for creativity. No dodge attacks, no directional attacks, no satisfying counterattack, no weapons of any sort besides your sword, no stances. This game is so stripped even of the slightest bit of depth. The one thing that gave this game an illusion of depth is that the parry timing is tighter. That's just one step forward and 15 steps back since it's literally an instant win. fine. I've heard people say that the new God of War has simple combat, which is true, but even those games have other attacks that don't require you to just spam the same buttons. You have axe throwing, you have dodge attacks, you can get certain hits of enemies if you parry with the correct shield. You have elemental damage, you have shield bashing, you have 3 weapons to choose through instead of just 1. You have actual combos and hold commands. Those games aren't exactly deep and honestly aren't even the pinnacle of great combat in any video game, but there's at least more to it than just spamming the attack button over and over and then dodging. What makes things worse is that it's piss easy. I wouldn't mind if it wasn't hard, but it was fun. But the attempt to make your attacks look cinematic and intense completely shackles the game into feeling way too scripted and on rails. I initially said it felt like Uncharted's melee combat, but even if that was button mashy and shallow, there were at least 2 things that made it tolerable. First thing is that you didn't have to just melee. You had guns and grenades, because the game was a third-person shooter. Second, melee was more strategic in use because of how many enemies could shoot at you if you melee guys mid-combat. Melee was discouraged, not because of the fact that it wasn't the focus, but because of how situational it was. Hellblade 2's relatively few combat segments just feel samey and there's nothing else to do. All you do is spam the light attack and maybe use the heavy attack to break a guard, but you're not even thinking about it all that much. It sucks that it's been 7 years and a whole console generation since the first game, but they didn't even feel like evolving the mechanics because it must look cinematic. Guys, look at the shaky cam. Doesn't it look like an intense action movie? Because forget about being 2% deep or even just having interesting mechanics. The only real mechanic is the focus thing from the first game. It's basically an insta-kill skill where you mash the attack button while holding down the trigger. The only way to stop this attack is to get hit, which only happens a few times. As long as you dodge it while using it, you'll be fine because it's basically just another win button, just like the parry, except even easier. The general strategy is to just spam attacks, doesn't matter if you get hit or not, and do the same focus move the whole game. Just cheese your way through combat because the game makes it easy enough to do that already. There's no depth, no challenge, just mashing buttons because these attacks look so cool with the shaky cam and the graphics are the only thing that matters anyway, right? Except not even that is true because it looks slow and sluggish and boring. If the simple combat was at least fun, I'd cut it some slack, but it's not fun, so there's nothing to praise here. This game weirdly reminds me of that recent Hellblade roguelike that came out last year. Yeah, funny how they both have hell in their name. Anyway, I recently tried the first 2 hours of it, and it's a pretty competent game. It's not very deep though. What I think separates it from the utter boredom of Hellblade 2's combat is the fact that at least it tries to make you feel strong, and it's not trying too hard to be realistic. It also helps that you're playing as a brutish figure, and you even have directional attacking. I'm not even saying that Hellblade was even that great, but it was at least more fun. There's so little to do in Hellblade's combat system that I'm having a hard time even trying to expand on anything I've already said. I'm trying so hard to make some sort of analysis on how bad this combat is, but it's so hilariously shallow that I can't really say anything more intelligent to make this video more interesting. Hilariously, the combat is the best part of the game because it's not a stupid puzzle segment or a walking sim moment, but it's still too tiring and shallow to make this game passable. Fun fact, while I was writing this script, I actually found out that there's a whole mode to simplify combat even further. Apparently in the settings, there's an autoplay feature for the combat. You heard that right, there's an autoplay feature for this mashy, boring, perfunctory combat system. Wait, so I was just able to not slog through combat the whole time? I can't believe I wasted my time playing the game and spending multiple pages writing about how boring the combat is. I'm sorry that I forgot that this isn't a video game instead of $50 collection of moments I'd rather watch on YouTube than play. Whoops. Remember, this is what you Hellblade fans waited 7 damn years for from Ninja Theory. This combat from Ninja Theory after they were bought by Microsoft with an extended staff of developers. I don't even blame the people who worked on it because it was clearly just an afterthought since the direction was just to look pretty. Oh right, I'm forgetting something. Boss fights. There are literally 2 boss fights in the whole game, and the other big moments are just on-rail sequences. I'm not even expecting this to have as many bosses as something like Final Fantasy XVI or Elden Ring, but come on. I'll admit that the on-rail sequences like the one in lava and the storm one are cool spectacles, I guess. They were the only cases where the game's speed actually moves faster than a crawl. Unfortunately, and ironically, there's still a giant lack of tension in these high-action moments. In a game like Uncharted, you had a hefty amount of control when you were in a scripted action moment, and there were consequences for dying. What made them feel tense wasn't just that the game was showing me, but that it was in tandem with what the enemies were doing, in what I as the player were doing. Getting through things like the train sequence in Uncharted 2 or the Madagascar chase in Uncharted 4 were satisfying because it felt like you were the reason you got through it and not just the game holding your hand. Hellblade 2's big action set pieces look cool and are more generally exciting than anything else from the game, but only in the sense that you're going from a nothing burger to a burger with only lettuce on it. There's no feeling that you could possibly die in any of these moments, even if you're slow enough to bail a scripted moment. In fact, if you die in these moments, you have about as much consequence for dying as you would in a Lego game. You get sent a few feet back, and then the set piece continues. Even in games where you can't fail QuickTime events, they at least have something outside of QuickTime events that requires your attention. Maybe it's a chase sequence or a boss fight you're already in. Speaking of boss fights, those are horrendous in this game. Contrary to YouTube walkthrough titles and thumbnails, there are only 2 actual boss fights in the game. You have the tutorial boss with the character you work with throughout the game. I think his name is like Thorbjorn or something? I don't remember. The boss fight is like every other standard one-on-one fight in this game, but he's slightly more powerful. And the other is the final boss, which is as boring as this one. Even as far as scripted boss fights go, they lack anything unique. You don't get a special weapon, nor is there a pattern. There aren't even any noticeable phase changes either. Even a game like Ghost of Tsushima, which also had one-on-one bosses in a small arena, at least had challenge and difficulty. Those bosses demanded more patience, and you couldn't just spam through the fight. They mixed things up between unblockables and attacks that you could perfect parry with proper timing. Even if the bosses of Ghost of Tsushima weren't that different from one another in terms of moveset, they at least made up for it with speed and fair difficulty. You get nothing out of these boss fights, if you can even call them boss fights in Hellblade 2. All you can do is spam attack and block, and it'd be okay if the game simply had satisfying combat, but it doesn't. Not every boss needs to be an Arkham City Mr. Freeze, where you need to analyze your surroundings. Sometimes boss fights can just be about fundamentals and practicing all the mechanics you learned on an enemy with more health and larger amount of moves. However, with Hellblade 2, I ask, what mechanics? Because there's nothing to test on these guys. It's not even a case of it being dumb fun either, so it's just a drag. I don't even think that the game is fun on a turn your brain off / power fantasy / button mashy level, where the combat isn't anything deep, but anti-boring. It's quite the opposite actually. It's just mind-numbing repetitive attack spamming that doesn't even actually look cool or feel good. All of the gameplay in Hellblade 2 was clearly a complete afterthought. Considering Hellblade fans had waited 7 years for this game to release, and waited 5 years since its announcement, it's very disappointing that they not only didn't evolve from the first game, but completely devolved into something so smoothed out and simplistic, just to serve the shiny graphics. I'm not one of those people who are like anti-realism in video games. I like the idea of something looking realistic, but at the same time, what are you offering me to play? What can I get out of this game that I can't get out of watching a full walkthrough on YouTube? I'll discuss it close to the end, but this gameplay doesn't feel like anything. It really is just playing with an empty soda bottle with a few droplets of the original drink. Sure, it can sometimes give you something that tries to make you feel excited, but ultimately, you're just following the scripted path. I think now is the time to talk about the thing that this game was clearly focused on the whole time. Unfortunately, that part has multiple problems too. Almost as many as the gameplay, in fact. So, let's talk about the story. So for this story, we're not going to do the standard summarization of events like usual. We'll just do a minor synopsis and then spoil the rest of the game. So if you weren't already spoiled by my gameplay commentary somehow, or cared that much about the story, you can go ahead and skip this part of the video. I'm pretty sure I'll just add segments as YouTube chapters, so it doesn't matter. Basically, after Senua learned to conquer the voices in her head in the first game, she set sail to the Norselands and is attacked by Northmen who are slavers, I guess. But there's where it gets interesting. She teams up with one of the raiders that attacked and raided her people, and then we get through a janky boss fight. Anyway, there are also Draugr now, I guess, who are Norse undead creatures. But you see, Senua has to take down these giants. There are only 2 of them in this game. But then she has to work with more people, and she tries going to the Northman leader, and she fights him, and then the game ends on a cliffhanger because Hellblade fans were waiting 7 years, only to wait possibly another 7 years for the true ending. This is the ending you get after trudging through 6 hours of work. Before we get to how bullshit that is, we should talk about something obvious to people who played the first game. So, Hellblade 2 foregoes the initial isolated feeling of the first game, and instead introduces wholly new characters for Senua to talk to and team up with. I think this is the major reason Hellblade didn't need a sequel, The original Hellblade was isolated and lonely on purpose for Senua's story. It made sense considering the game was about her battling with psychosis, moving on from the death of loved ones, and how she used the voices in her head for good. The story didn't stick out as much to me as it did to other people, but it felt like there was a purpose in making her alone. And it's honestly why I don't think a sequel to the first was needed, because doing the isolation thing again would be repetitive, and adding characters would make it generic if it's not well written enough. This game's characters absolutely blow since they lack any development. All they really act as are exposition devices that don't really make them feel like actual characters. Even when they try developing them, it rings hollow because you know the game is too short to develop them anyway. I think only one character to have one sort of arc is the guy you pair up with in the beginning. Unfortunately, I keep forgetting his name. Oh wait, I put it in the script, it's Storbjorn, whatever. Anyway, I forget about everyone else's name, because I genuinely do not give a shit. Those guys get literally no development or attention, and it's not like the game made me care enough about them to learn more anyway. Senua doesn't fare too much better either. The problem isn't precisely her, but the Furies. The fact that the game quite often spoon feeds its character development with these voices is laughable. I'm okay with the voices being imperative to her character development, but it doesn't feel like they're part of her development, and more like they're congratulating her for developing. Actually, the voices are the most annoying part of this game, in all facets. In gameplay, they're annoying in handholding, and in the story, they just tell and don't show. It's like after the major development in the first game, they didn't know what they could do narratively with them. Every time the shadow voice comes in, the other voices start saying things that the audience would be saying if the story was at all engaging. They'll always be like, "Don't listen, Senua. Don't give in, Senua." Even when the shadow doesn't come in, they won't shut the hell up. They always congratulate Senua for beating a puzzle or winning a combat encounter, which is already patronizing in gameplay, but even more so in the story. The voices were the standout in the first game. It felt like they were helpful in both gameplay and narrative, but here they feel disruptive and exasperatingly bad in their implementation in the story. The voices in the first game didn't always feel this way because Senua was the only character there. So, since Senua was the only main character, it didn't feel like they were cutting in or interrupting important exposition. The sequel's emphasis on having side characters makes the voices seem more agitating because while other characters are giving exposition, they just butt into conversation to basically simplify what they were saying or to tell Senua how to feel. All they add is extra noise to an experience with more than enough. In every part of the game, they will consistently ruin any moment of Senua's growth with their incessant need to commentate over everything she does. I guess you could say it makes it, quote, more realistic to have disparate thoughts induced by psychosis constantly yelling at you, but for the sake of a story, you should let them give me information that's actually helpful and not just describe everything the main character is doing like the audience can't see it. The voices now serve as nothing more than to service the sound design, which is cool, but its narrative impact ranges from slim to audibly frustrating. It sucks to think that what went from a great narrative tool to push character development has now been dumbed down into condescending audio description. I swear I never even talked about Senua in this entire story section. And that's just because there's nothing to really write about. It's not the fact that the stuff she does particularly sucks, but it's the fact that it's already ruined by the voices once again. Like I mentioned earlier, she can't go one moment of development without this game's voices saying, "You did it," or "You're strong." Senua's whole arc is ruined by the fact that her arc is just talked through, and the fact that the game doesn't have an ending. Believe it or not, this game has an abrupt and confusing ending and that sets up a third game. If I had a nickel for every time a game I played in 2024 didn't have an actual ending, I'd have 2 nickels. Not a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice, right? So basically, after the final boss, who was the father of the first guy we met, and also summon the giants after making a deal with a god or something, dies after Senua beats him. He kills his son, by the way, if you weren't paying attention to this boring ass game. Senua then encounters the darkness again and learns that there's always a choice to kill and not kill or whatever. Unfortunately, this moment is cut short by not having any falling action or resolution. Sometimes stories having endings that are clearly there to set up sequels is fine. Look at the biggest blockbuster movies of all time that have cliffhangers. The difference is that video games take way longer to conceptualize and to make in comparison to TV, movies, and books. With movies, it's a matter of waiting a year or two, unless it's waiting for the third Spider-Verse, but that's under different circumstances. In the case of modern video games, it's a case of waiting 4+ years for an ending if there's a cliffhanger. The ending in itself is also really vague, and feels less like it wants you to feel anything, and more like it wants you to think. I swear, this isn't a script for the Final Fantasy VII Rebirth video, which is never happening, by the way. Despite this being a game that's so willing to hold your hand throughout all of its gameplay and explain all of its character development, development moments in ways that talk down to its audience, it has an ending that would likely be too confusing for someone who isn't as writing savvy. Hellblade 2's whole story is honestly mediocre and a massive disappointment. Considering that the first game's story was its best element and done amazingly, it was frankly absurd that the story here is such a downgrade in comparison. All of it is slow and dull and does nothing to make me care as much, and if it does, it squanders it immediately. Senua's Sacrifice was a game I didn't feel needed a sequel back when I played the game on my PS4 in 2017. Sucks to see that I was absolutely correct when I was like 12 years old. Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice was a game about an isolated woman fighting her demons and overcoming them. It had a whole plot mountain: the exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. Senua's Saga Hellblade 2, yes, I'm aware that the naming format is still stupid, has exposition, rising action, and barely a climax, but there's no end yet. And the character arcs aren't even satisfying enough to justify the cliffhanger. The characters are so boring and underdeveloped, and the addition of other characters alongside Senua doesn't really add anything. It may sometimes have an exciting cutscene to watch, but it's ultimately not a fulfilling experience of any kind. Playing through this game's story was already a chore as it is, so just watch a YouTuber if you care at all. That's the only thing I have to say before I get into this conclusion. Just watch it on YouTube. It's hard to know if Hellblade 3 will even be a thing, considering how Microsoft in the past few months has been shutting down studios left and right, along with the fact that the game kinda flopped. The marketing for the game was also very bad. Not only did it barely have marketing up until the last few weeks of its release, but also didn't have anything to market for this relatively short game. Whether this game was a success or flop doesn't change how I feel about it, which would still be a shiny walking simulator. I put a disclaimer in there earlier, but for those who wanted to listen to me but still think I'm bullshitting, let me explain. I love narrative-focused single-player games, but there has to be a balance of sort. You may think I have a bias towards PlayStation single-player games just because you've probably never seen me criticize some of them. I haven't played since I was 14, but Death Stranding was honestly boring as Hellblade 2, but even that game felt like you had a purpose. I played Senua's Sacrifice on my PS4 back when I had one, and I didn't even care for its gameplay that much then. Xbox's single-player story-focused stuff has been barren anyway, so me disliking Hellblade more than a Sony exclusive shouldn't even be a shock. Probably controversial, but some of the best single-player games I've played in the past decade that were narrative-focused have been God of War Ragnarok and Persona 5. I won't even put them in my top 5 or even top 10 games of all time, but they had something Hellblade 2 didn't: balance. Some of my favorite parts of both of those games were their stories, but they never neglected gameplay either. Yes, in Ragnarok you would have long cutscenes at times and heavy amounts of story, but then you'll be dropped into a lengthy combat section and a 15-minute long boss fight or something. And Persona 5 is a JRPG, so it's pretty heavy on the story, the party members, and the character development. However, despite its narrative focus, the combat system and general gameplay was still a major focus for the game. Persona 5 melds the turn-based combat and party system with its narrative and feels incredibly balanced as it interweaves different parts of this. There's definitely a way to have both story and gameplay come together to form a cohesive gaming experience. And every now and again, I'll even go back to games that are lighter on their story and all about gameplay. I don't need every game to have a deep story or something that will make me contemplate my worldview. Sometimes I want a purely fun power fantasy action game or a calm platformer from time to time, but even those can have somewhat enjoyable stories with interesting lore. I've always felt that the argument that most story-focused games are just walking sims never really had a lot of weight when you realize that they have plenty of combat sections or main gameplay moments. Yes, there are long story moments, but the focus is usually mainly gameplay. It's not just PlayStation Studios games either. Games like Nier, Persona, Batman Arkham, Final Fantasy, Guardians of the Galaxy, Red Dead Redemption 1 and 2, Metal Gear Solid, Half-Life, Yakuza, the Star Wars Jedi games. All of those games are focused on their stories. It have slow walking segments, sure, maybe even a few scripted action segments, but at their core, their gameplay is important. You can have a story, even if it has cutscenes longer than 2 minutes. You can even have games like Telltale games, which technically don't even have gameplay. Even in a Telltale game, you have choices that affect the stories, which is the gameplay. It tests your mind. You'll even have a QuickTime event that may or may not impact the story that much. They also had well-written stories that were fun to venture through. Hellblade 2 didn't have the luxury of even having meaningful gameplay. Instead of having good puzzles that tested your intelligence, it had tedious ones that tested your patience. Instead of having cool looking combat that's fun, or even that feels good, even if it isn't that deep. It has combat that's boring and unsatisfying, and can't even be shallow in a way that would impress anyone who's looking for a button masher. Even as far as tech demos go, it was released far too late into the console generation to feel like that much of an impressive showcase. Even games like Rise Son of Rome and The Order 1886 were released close enough to the release of their consoles to at least make them make sense as tech demos. The Xbox Series X came out in 2020. It's 2024 now, and it's not that impressive anymore. The game just makes me ask, what do I get out of this if I play it and don't watch the cutscenes on YouTube? The answer is nothing. There is nothing to get out of it. Not even really a good narrative that simply feels emotionally satisfying to play through like the first Last of Us or something. Even a game like The Last of Us knew when to place substance in terms of gameplay, like horror sequences, or stealth, or general gunplay. Hellblade 2 is what people think of when it really comes to boring single-player story-focused games. It's a game where most of your activity is walking and talking over anything fun. And it's not being an ADHD TikTok brain child to expect an action-adventure game to have action or adventure or to be at least entertaining. Even the best action-adventure games have slow walking and talking segments, but those were usually used to take breaks for the big action set pieces or to prepare you for the next set piece, not to replace gameplay entirely. Instead of using slower pacing to allow for people to take a breather, they instead use it to substitute real gameplay. In the end, I feel bad for Ninja Theory, as far as Hellblade 2 is concerned. A lot of people make it a console war / Xbox versus PlayStation thing, but it's more than that. It's an example of how focusing too much on a story that isn't even good and not enough on gameplay makes a game not fun. We all thought Microsoft buying Ninja Theory would mean a few more improvements at the very least to Hellblade's formula, but that wasn't even the case. Unfortunately, the game didn't even have enough adoring fans nor the sales to back it up. I really hope that Ninja Theory isn't on Microsoft's developer hit list next. Ninja Theory as a company has a lot of potential as far as making fun games goes. Again, even something like DMC Devil May Cry had fun enough combat at the very least. Even the first Hellblade had a slight puddle of depth compared to the sequel. Not much, but significantly more? Sadly, it's easy to have more than nothing if you add anything in the first place. If it's not the end of Ninja Theory, I'm hoping they're able to pick themselves back up for the third game, or maybe just anything else. Maybe next time they won't make a game that's just a tech demo that's years late to the party. Maybe one day they'll actually focus on gameplay.